The night sky over Greenwood Estates in Lakeview, Illinois, was ablaze with bursts of red, white, and blue. Fireworks exploded in celebration of the 4th of July, their echoes rolling across the calm surface of Lake Greenwood. The Atwood family's grand estate sat at the edge of the water, its expansive lawns illuminated by the flickering glow of patriotism. Yet, inside the mansion, an altogether different scene was unfolding, one that would never be commemorated in history books. Clara Atwood sat frozen in the corner of Edward Atwood's study. Her breaths came in short, sharp gasps as her trembling hands clutched the armrests of a leather chair. Across the room, the lifeless body of Edward, her husband's grandfather, lay sprawled over his mahogany desk. Blood pooled beneath his head, staining the pristine Persian rug, a stark crimson against ivory. The silence inside the room was deafening, broken only by the distant crackle of fireworks and the occasional cheers of revelers enjoying the holiday. To Clara, the festive sounds felt like a cruel mockery of her reality. She stared at the ornate paperweight on the desk, its once polished brass surface now smeared with blood. She hadn't meant for it to happen. It wasn't supposed to end this way. How did it come to this? The question repeated in her mind, drowning out any semblance of rational thought. Only hours earlier, she had been smiling at the family gathering on the estate's patio, playing the perfect wife to Daniel Atwood and the dutiful granddaughter-in-law to Edward. No one would have guessed that behind her forced smiles, Clara was suffocating under the weight of secrets and lies. Edward's study, tucked away in a secluded wing of the mansion, had always been a place she dreaded. It was a room that exuded power, with its towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound tomes and its walls adorned with stern portraits of Atwood ancestors. Tonight, it had become a chamber of judgment, a tomb. She replayed the events in her mind. The argument had started innocuously, as so many of their conversations did. Edward, calm and composed, had reminded her of the leverage he held over her, the affair, her lies, and the fragile foundation of her marriage to Daniel. His voice, smooth and dripping with control, had been like a noose tightening around her neck. "I've given you choices, Clara," Edward had said, leaning back in his chair with that smug expression she loathed. "But you seem determined to test my patience. Do you really think Daniel will forgive you when he finds out what you've done? Or that you can live without my protection?" His words had cut through her like shards of glass. Her instincts had screamed at her to leave, but Edward's threats had always chained her to her seat. She had tried to reason with him, to plead for her freedom, but Edward was immovable, a stone wall of cold dominance. Then something inside her snapped. The exact moment was a blur, a haze of fear and rage converging into blind action. 1 second, Edward was smirking, leaning forward to deliver yet another venomous ultimatum. The next, Clara's hand had closed around the heavy paperweight, and she had brought it down with all her might. Now, she sat in the suffocating aftermath, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. The fireworks outside were nothing but muted thuds in her ears. Her gaze drifted back to Edward's lifeless form. The monster who had haunted her life was gone, but at what cost? The door to the study remained ajar, a chilling invitation for anyone to stumble upon the scene. Clara knew she couldn't stay there, but her body refused to move. The holiday outside continued, blissfully unaware of the nightmare that had unfolded within the Atwood estate. Somewhere in the distance, another firework exploded. This time, the sound was no celebration, it was an omen. The Atwood family was the picture of American prosperity. From their sprawling estate overlooking the serene Lake Greenwood to their well-polished appearances at local charity galas, they embodied the values of wealth, power, and respectability. But behind the gilded facade of the Atwood name lay a labyrinth of secrets, manipulation, and ambition, a world where family ties were more like shackles. At the heart of this twisted web was Clara Atwood, the young wife of Daniel Atwood, heir to the family's vast fortune. At just 23, Clara had once believed she had found her fairy tale ending. Marrying into the Atwood family seemed like a dream come true. Daniel, at 25, was handsome, driven, and determined to step out of the shadow of his grandfather, Edward Atwood, the family's formidable patriarch. But dreams have a way of curdling into nightmares. Clara had hoped her life at the estate would bring comfort and security. Instead, it had turned into a gilded prison. Daniel, though loving in his own way, was consumed by the demands of his burgeoning career and his obligation to meet Edward's sky-high expectations. Often away on business trips or buried in his work, Daniel had little time for the woman he had vowed to cherish. The cracks in their marriage, once hairline fractures, had widened into unbridgeable chasms. Loneliness had been Clara's constant companion in the grand halls of the Atwood estate. The vast mansion felt like an echo chamber, amplifying her isolation. It was in this void that Ryan Morgan entered her life. He was everything Daniel wasn't: young, carefree, and unburdened by the suffocating weight of legacy. Their affair had started innocently, a stolen glance at a local cafe, a conversation that lasted longer than it should have. Before Clara could stop herself, she was entangled in a secret she knew could destroy her. But the real threat didn't come from Daniel. It came from Edward. Edward Atwood, 79, was a man whose presence loomed over every aspect of the family. A self-made billionaire, he had built the Atwood empire from nothing, and he expected nothing less than absolute control over everyone who bore his name. To outsiders, he was a respected elder statesman, a philanthropist with a sharp mind and a seemingly gentle demeanor. Within the family, however, he was a tyrant, a man who wielded his power with precision and ruthlessness. Clara had always felt uneasy around Edward. There was something about the way his piercing blue eyes seemed to see straight through her, as if dissecting her every thought. His words were always carefully chosen, laced with subtle implications and veiled threats. Clara had tried to avoid him, to keep their interactions polite and brief. But Edward was a predator, and Clara was caught in his sights. The day Edward discovered Clara's affair marked the beginning of her nightmare. At first, she thought he would erupt in anger, confronting her or Daniel in one of his infamous tirades. Instead, Edward was calm, calculating. He cornered her in his study one January afternoon, the dim light casting long shadows across the room's polished oak surfaces. "I know about your little secret," he had said, his voice low and even. Clara froze, her stomach lurching. "Don't bother denying it. I've seen the texts, the receipts. You've been careless." Her breath caught in her throat. How could he have known? She had been so careful, or so she thought. Edward didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His power was in his composure. "You'll do exactly as I say," he continued, "or I will ruin you. Daniel will know everything, and when I'm done, you'll be nothing but a tarnished memory in this family's history." And so, Clara's world had begun to crumble. She tried to distance herself from Ryan, but Edward always seemed to know. His control was absolute, his reach extending into every corner of her life. He became a constant shadow, his presence suffocating, his demands unrelenting. Even Daniel wasn't spared. Edward had begun planting seeds of doubt in his grandson's mind, subtle remarks about Clara's behavior, innocent questions that made Daniel second-guess her every move. The once loving husband was becoming colder, more distant. Clara could feel the trust between them slipping away, like sand through her fingers. The Atwood estate, once a symbol of grandeur, had become a battleground of lies and manipulation. Clara, caught between Edward's threats and her crumbling marriage, found herself trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. But Edward wasn't just a manipulative tyrant. Clara was beginning to suspect there was something even darker beneath the surface, secrets that went far beyond her affair. She could sense it in the way Edward watched her, the way he seemed to enjoy her suffering. There were whispers in the family of women who had crossed Edward before, stories of disappearances and scandals buried beneath layers of wealth and power. Clara's only hope was to survive long enough to find a way out. But in the Atwood family, freedom always came at a price. By the time January snow blanketed the sprawling grounds of the Atwood estate, Clara Atwood had already begun to feel the full weight of Edward's control. His discovery of her affair with Ryan Morgan hadn't ignited the fiery confrontation she had feared. Instead, it had triggered something far worse, a cold, calculated campaign of manipulation. Edward didn't just want to punish Clara, he wanted to own her. The first time he confronted her in his study, Edward's tone was deceptively measured. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten in the conventional sense. Instead, his words carried the sharp precision of a scalpel. "Clara," he began, his fingers steepled as he leaned back in his leather chair. "You've disappointed me. I thought you were smarter than this." Clara had stood frozen, the weight of his accusation hitting her like a blow. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice trembling under the suffocating gaze of his icy blue eyes. Edward allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "Oh, but you do. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." He laid it out for her then, in excruciating detail. The receipts from a hotel 2 towns over. The text messages exchanged late at night. The undeniable evidence of her secret rendezvous with Ryan. Clara's mind reeled. How had he uncovered so much? She had been careful, or so she thought. Her instinct had been to beg, to plead for him to keep her secret. But Edward didn't need her to beg. He already held all the cards. "I have no intention of ruining you, Clara," he said, his voice smooth and disarmingly calm. "Not unless you force my hand. What happens next depends entirely on you." It wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum wrapped in silk. From that moment, Clara's life became a delicate balancing act. She danced to Edward's tune, terrified of the consequences if she didn't. Her freedom, her marriage, her very identity, Edward threatened them all without ever raising his voice. Edward's influence wasn't limited to Clara. Slowly, insidiously, he began sowing seeds of doubt in Daniel's mind. At first, it was subtle, offhand comments made during family dinners or quiet moments in the study. "Daniel, I couldn't help but notice Clara's been a little distracted lately," Edward would remark, his tone feigning concern. "Are you sure everything's all right between the two of you?" Daniel, a man who had always trusted his wife implicitly, began to second-guess himself. He started noticing things he might otherwise have overlooked, the way Clara would avoid his eyes when he asked about her day, the mysterious phone calls she hurriedly ended, the tension in her body whenever Edward was in the room. Clara felt the shift almost immediately. Daniel's once warm affection was replaced by a quiet suspicion that hung in the air like a storm cloud. He didn't accuse her outright, but his questions grew more pointed. His gaze lingered on her longer, as if searching for something she wasn't saying. For Clara, the walls were closing in. Edward's manipulation was tightening its grip, and she felt powerless to stop it. Every attempt she made to salvage her marriage only seemed to deepen Daniel's doubts. She wanted to tell him the truth, to explain everything, but fear held her back. If Edward could destroy her life with a single word, what would happen if she defied him? What made Edward truly dangerous wasn't just his power or his cunning, it was the way he seemed to relish the game. He didn't just want to control Clara, he wanted her to feel the weight of his dominance, to understand that every move she made was dictated by his will. He began demanding more of her. A forced dinner in his study. A private conversation under the guise of discussing family matters. Each interaction left Clara feeling more like a pawn in his twisted game. His words were always laced with double meanings, each one a reminder of the leverage he held over her. "You're part of this family now, Clara," he said one evening as he poured himself a glass of bourbon. "And being part of this family means knowing your place." Clara's resentment grew with every passing day. She hated the way he looked at her, the way his eyes seemed to strip away her defenses, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She hated the way he spoke to her, always calm, always in control, as if he were a king addressing a lowly subject. But most of all, she hated the way he made her feel, small, powerless, and utterly alone. By the end of February, Clara was no longer the woman she had been when she first married Daniel. Edward's manipulation had turned her into a shell of herself. The affair with Ryan had ended abruptly, a casualty of Edward's threats, but the damage had already been done. Clara's once happy marriage was crumbling under the weight of lies and suspicion. And Edward wasn't done. His obsession with Clara was growing, shifting from control to something deeper, darker. He began hinting at a future where Daniel was no longer in the picture, where it would be just the two of them. Clara tried to dismiss his remarks as the ramblings of a delusional old man. But deep down, she knew Edward meant every word. She also knew that she couldn't endure much more. The fractures in the Atwood family were growing deeper, and Clara was caught at the center of it all. The question wasn't whether she would break, it was how much damage would be done when she finally did. The Atwood family had always been complicated. Behind the polished exterior of wealth and influence lay fractured bonds, buried grudges, and power struggles disguised as family traditions. Edward Atwood, the patriarch, stood at the center of it all, a man whose shadow loomed over every decision made within the family. His dominance wasn't limited to business, it extended into every corner of their personal lives, weaving a tangled web of control that ensnared everyone under his roof. For Daniel Atwood, the expectations placed upon him by his grandfather were suffocating. Edward had molded Daniel to be his successor from a young age, training him in the ruthless ways of business and life. But Edward's mentorship was a double-edged sword. What appeared to be guidance was, in truth, a means of ensuring Daniel's dependency on him. Edward didn't just want Daniel to succeed, he wanted him to succeed his way. Daniel, for all his ambition, was growing weary of Edward's interference. His marriage to Clara had once been his sanctuary, a safe harbor from the storms of Atwood family dynamics. But as Clara grew distant, thanks to Edward's manipulations, Daniel found himself increasingly isolated. Edward seized upon this opportunity to tighten his grip. "Marriage is a delicate thing, Daniel," Edward said one evening over a glass of whiskey, the firelight casting sharp shadows on his weathered face. "You must pay attention to the small things. A wandering eye, a sudden change in behavior, these are signs you can't afford to ignore." Daniel frowned, unsure of what his grandfather was implying but unable to shake the seed of doubt now planted in his mind. Edward's words were always measured, never overt accusations, but they had a way of lingering. For Clara, life in the Atwood family had become a minefield. Edward's control over her was absolute, but his manipulation of Daniel added a new layer of torment. She could see the changes in her husband, the way his questions became more pointed, the way his gaze lingered on her longer than it used to. Daniel didn't confront her directly, but the unspoken tension between them was palpable. Clara felt as though she were being pulled in two directions. On one side was Edward, whose threats and obsessions held her captive. On the other was Daniel, whose love was now tinged with suspicion. The two men she had once seen as protector and partner were becoming her greatest adversaries. Her isolation deepened with each passing day. She no longer confided in Daniel, fearing that anything she said might be used against her. Even the estate itself seemed to conspire against her. The grand halls, once awe-inspiring, now felt like prison walls. Every creak of the floorboards, every echo of her footsteps, reminded her that there was no escape. What began as a calculated act of manipulation was morphing into something far more dangerous. Edward's obsession with Clara was no longer just about control, it was personal. He began spending more time with her, orchestrating moments where they were alone under the guise of discussing family matters. During one such conversation in his study, Edward leaned in closer than necessary, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her. "You and I," he said, his voice low and intimate, "we understand each other in ways Daniel never could. It's a pity he doesn't appreciate what he has." Clara's skin crawled. She wanted to scream, to run, but the iron grip of Edward's power held her in place. She could only force a tight smile and nod, knowing any hint of resistance would provoke him further. As Clara endured Edward's suffocating presence, she began to notice things, fragments of conversations, whispers among the household staff, and glances exchanged between family members. Slowly, a chilling picture began to emerge. One evening, while wandering the library in a futile attempt to clear her mind, she stumbled upon a photograph tucked inside a book on the Atwood family's history. It was a picture of a woman she didn't recognize, standing beside a much younger Edward. Scribbled on the back were the words, Catherine Atwood, 1973. Clara had never heard of a Catherine Atwood. She searched for more information, piecing together snippets from old letters and documents she found hidden among Edward's things. What she uncovered was alarming. Catherine had been Edward's first daughter-in-law, married to his eldest son, and had disappeared under mysterious circumstances decades ago. The family had buried the story, erasing her from their history. The more Clara dug, the more she found. Catherine wasn't the only one. There were other women who had been close to Edward, women who had seemingly vanished without a trace. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into the same fate. Edward's words from their last conversation echoed in her mind, "You're part of this family now, Clara. And being part of this family means knowing your place." She realized with a jolt that Edward didn't just want to control her, he wanted to consume her, to make her entirely his. Clara's discovery of Catherine's story was the first real crack in Edward's armor. For the first time, she saw him not just as a manipulative patriarch but as a predator, someone who had likely done this before and would do it again. The realization both terrified and steeled her. She knew she couldn't let herself become the next Catherine Atwood. But Edward was always watching, always one step ahead. Clara didn't know how much time she had before he made his next move, but one thing was clear, she was running out of it. By the time June's humid summer heat settled over Greenwood Estates, Clara Atwood's life was unraveling. The suffocating grip of Edward's control, the growing chasm between her and Daniel, and the secrets she now carried were too much to bear. Every step she took inside the Atwood mansion felt like navigating a labyrinth where Edward lurked at every turn, tightening his noose around her with chilling precision. Edward's obsession with Clara had deepened. His once veiled comments about their unique bond became more explicit, more dangerous. His gaze lingered too long, his touches on her shoulder too deliberate. He began dropping chilling hints during their forced encounters in his study. "Do you ever wonder," he mused one afternoon, "what your life could be like without Daniel?" His words hung in the air like poison, twisting into Clara's mind. She stiffened, refusing to meet his gaze, but her silence only emboldened him. "You and I," he continued, his voice low and deliberate, "could have a future free from all this pretense." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Edward was no longer simply manipulating her, he was fantasizing about a life where Daniel no longer existed. The implications made her stomach churn. But when she tried to dismiss his words as the ramblings of a delusional man, Edward's cold smile told her otherwise. He was planning something. Meanwhile, Daniel had become almost unrecognizable. The seeds of doubt Edward had planted had grown into a toxic mistrust that now poisoned every interaction between him and Clara. He questioned her whereabouts, her intentions, even the smallest inconsistencies in her stories. His once gentle demeanor had hardened, his love replaced by suspicion. Clara couldn't blame him entirely. Edward's manipulations were masterful, designed to erode the foundation of their marriage brick by brick. But the distance between them cut her deeply. She had once thought of Daniel as her safe harbor, her partner in life. Now, he felt like another interrogator, another source of pressure in a life already teetering on the edge. Trapped between Edward's escalating obsession and Daniel's growing distrust, Clara's mental state began to deteriorate. She barely slept, her nights haunted by nightmares of Edward's threats and cryptic hints about Daniel's fate. The mansion that had once felt so grand now loomed over her like a prison, its walls closing in with every passing day. Her discovery of Catherine Atwood's disappearance only deepened her terror. She couldn't shake the parallels between herself and the women who had come before her, women who had crossed Edward and vanished without a trace. It was no longer just her marriage or her reputation at stake, it was her life. By late June, Clara knew she had to act. But what could she do? Confessing everything to Daniel might save her marriage, but Edward's retaliation would be swift and devastating. Running away wasn't an option. Edward's reach extended far beyond the estate, and he would find her no matter where she went. Her mind spun with impossible choices, each one leading to ruin. The pressure built inside her like a boiling kettle, and she could feel herself inching closer to breaking. On the evening of June 30th, Clara found herself once again summoned to Edward's study. She entered the room reluctantly, her heart pounding as she faced the man who had single-handedly dismantled her life. Edward was seated behind his desk, a glass of bourbon in hand, his expression calm but predatory. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone casual but laden with menace. "Daniel is becoming an obstacle. He's too distracted by his insecurities to see what's best for this family." Clara's stomach twisted. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "I'm saying that perhaps it's time we stop letting him get in the way. Imagine what we could accomplish without him." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a declaration. Edward was proposing to eliminate Daniel, and he expected Clara to not only condone it but to participate. "No," she blurted out, her voice trembling. "You can't." "I won't." Edward's smile vanished, replaced by a steely glare. "You don't have a choice, Clara," he said coldly. "If you think you can stop me, you're deluding yourself. And if you dare to oppose me, well, you know how that ends." The threat was clear, and Clara felt the walls of the study closing in around her. She could no longer deny the truth. Edward was dangerous, and he wouldn't stop until he had everything he wanted. That night, Clara sat alone in her bedroom, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the window. She barely recognized the woman looking back, pale, gaunt, and haunted. Edward's words echoed in her mind, a relentless drumbeat of fear and inevitability. She realized that no one was coming to save her. Daniel was too blinded by his doubts to see the danger, and Edward held all the power. If she didn't act, she would lose everything, her marriage, her freedom, her life. But what could she do? How could she fight a man as powerful and cunning as Edward? Every option felt like a trap, every move a step closer to destruction. The breaking point was near, and Clara could feel it in her bones. She wasn't just fighting for her survival anymore, she was fighting for her very soul. The night of July 4th arrived with a deceptive sense of normalcy. The Atwood estate was alive with the sounds of celebration as fireworks exploded over Lake Greenwood, their brilliant colors reflecting off the tranquil waters. The mansion's sprawling lawns were dotted with guests enjoying drinks and laughter, the perfect image of a wealthy family's festivities. But inside the grand halls, Clara Atwood's world was unraveling toward an inevitable and violent end. Clara had spent the day in a daze, going through the motions of hosting alongside Daniel. She plastered on a smile as guests greeted her, exchanged pleasantries that she barely registered. Her mind raced with Edward's words from their last encounter in his study. "It's time for us to make a choice, Clara. You and I can't move forward unless Daniel is out of the picture." Every fiber of her being wanted to escape, to run far from the estate and its suffocating secrets. But Edward's threats echoed in her mind. She knew his reach was inescapable. If she fled, he would destroy her, and likely Daniel as well. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first fireworks of the evening lit up the sky, Clara's nerves were stretched to their breaking point. Edward had summoned her to his study once again. This time, she knew there would be no placating him. Clara stepped into Edward's study, the door creaking ominously as she pushed it open. The room was dimly lit, the flickering glow from the fireplace casting eerie shadows on the walls lined with books and stern ancestral portraits. Edward was seated behind his desk, as composed and commanding as ever. A glass of bourbon sat untouched beside him, and his piercing blue eyes fixed on Clara the moment she entered. "You're late," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "I don't appreciate being kept waiting." Clara hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the door. She wanted to turn and run, but her feet refused to move. Instead, she stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. "What do you want from me, Edward?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound composed. Edward leaned back in his chair, studying her like a chess piece he was about to sacrifice. "You know what I want, Clara," he said. "I've made myself clear. Daniel's time is up. You need to accept that." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. "You're insane," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You can't do this. I won't let you." Edward's expression darkened. He stood, his imposing figure looming over her as he stepped around the desk. "You don't have a choice," he said coldly. "This isn't about what you want, it's about what's necessary. Daniel is a liability, and he's standing in the way of everything you and I could have." His words sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She backed away, her pulse quickening as Edward moved closer, his presence suffocating. "Stay away from me," she warned, her voice rising. Edward laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the room. "What are you going to do, Clara? Fight me? You're nothing without me. Everything you have, your marriage, your status, it's all because of me. You owe me." Something inside Clara snapped. Months of manipulation, threats, and fear boiled over into a surge of anger and desperation. Her eyes darted to the desk, where an ornate brass paperweight sat gleaming in the firelight. Her fingers closed around it before she even realized what she was doing. "I don't owe you anything," she screamed, her voice trembling with fury. Edward's smug smile faltered as Clara raised the paperweight. He stepped forward, reaching for her, but she brought it down with all her strength. The heavy object struck him squarely on the temple with a sickening thud. Edward staggered, his expression frozen in shock as blood trickled down the side of his face. He collapsed against the desk, his legs giving out beneath him, and slumped to the floor. The room was silent except for Clara's ragged breathing. She stared at his lifeless form, her hands trembling as the paperweight slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. Blood pooled beneath Edward's head, staining the edges of the Persian rug. For a moment, Clara couldn't move. She stood frozen, her mind unable to process what she had just done. Edward Atwood, the man who had tormented her, controlled her, threatened her, was gone. The power he had wielded over her life had evaporated in an instant, leaving only the heavy silence of his study. But as the adrenaline faded, reality came crashing down. She had killed him. Not in self-defense, but in a moment of blind rage and desperation. Her chest tightened, panic clawing at her throat as she stared at the bloodied scene before her. The muffled sound of fireworks outside felt like a cruel reminder of the world beyond the mansion's walls, a world blissfully unaware of the nightmare that had unfolded within. Clara stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. Her heart pounded in her ears as she fought to steady herself. She needed to think, to act, but what could she do? Call the police? Try to cover it up? She didn't have a plan, only the crushing weight of her actions and the knowledge that she was utterly alone. Somewhere in the distance, a firework exploded, its thunderous crack shattering the silence. Clara flinched, her body trembling as she turned toward the door. She knew she couldn't stay in the study, but every step felt like wading through quicksand. As she fled the room, the echoes of Edward's threats lingered in her mind, mingling with the haunting realization of what she had become. The monster was dead, but at what cost? The morning after Edward Atwood's murder was eerily quiet. The sunlight filtered through the grand windows of the Atwood estate, casting long shadows across the opulent interiors. The cheerful remnants of the 4th of July celebrations, empty champagne glasses, stray fireworks casings, lay scattered across the lawn. But inside the mansion, there was no sign of celebration, only a chilling sense of unease. The discovery of Edward's body in his study sent shockwaves through the household. It was the maid who found him, her scream shattering the early morning calm as she stumbled upon the lifeless figure slumped against his desk. Blood had dried on the edges of the Persian rug, and the ornate brass paperweight lay on the floor, its surface tarnished with crimson. By the time the police arrived, the estate was already a hive of whispered speculation and thinly veiled fear. The Atwood family's impeccable image was now under threat, and the weight of maintaining their facade bore down on everyone, especially Clara. Detective Sarah McAllister, a seasoned investigator from the Lakeview Police Department, was quick to take charge. She had seen her fair share of crimes in affluent circles, where secrets were buried beneath layers of wealth and privilege. From the moment she stepped into Edward's study, she knew this wasn't a simple robbery or random act of violence. This was personal. McAllister's keen eyes scanned the scene, the meticulously organized desk, the shattered glass of bourbon on the floor, and the paperweight, which appeared to be the murder weapon. She noticed the faint scuff marks on the rug, suggesting a brief struggle, and the absence of any signs of forced entry. "This wasn't an accident," she murmured, her voice low but resolute. "Someone in this house knows what happened." Clara had barely slept since the murder. The weight of her actions bore down on her, but she knew she couldn't reveal the truth, not yet. When the detectives approached her for questioning, she steeled herself, forcing a mask of grief and shock over her fear. "Mrs. Atwood," Detective McAllister began, her voice calm but probing, "can you tell me where you were last night?" Clara's throat tightened. She had rehearsed her answer, but under the detective's piercing gaze, her words felt hollow. "I was with the guests, on the lawn," she stammered. "I went to bed early. I didn't hear anything." McAllister's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't press further, yet. Clara could feel the weight of suspicion creeping toward her, like a predator stalking its prey. Every question, every pause, felt like an eternity. As the investigation progressed, the detectives uncovered layers of the Atwood family's secrets. The paper trail. Text messages and emails on Edward's phone painted a damning picture. There were cryptic exchanges between Edward and Clara, messages filled with veiled threats and Edward's overbearing tone. It became clear that their relationship was far from the harmonious image the family projected. Whispers of the past. Interviews with household staff unearthed troubling details. One maid mentioned overhearing heated arguments between Edward and Clara, while another recounted stories of Edward's controlling nature. There were whispers, too, of women who had been similarly targeted by Edward in the past, women like Catherine Atwood, whose disappearance decades earlier remained an unspoken wound within the family. Daniel's growing distrust. The detectives turned their attention to Daniel, whose strained relationship with Clara had not gone unnoticed. When asked about his wife's behavior, he hesitated, his face clouded with confusion and doubt. "She's been distant," he admitted. "I don't know what's been going on with her lately." Daniel's uncertainty only added to the intrigue, but McAllister sensed that Clara was the key to unraveling the truth. Under the mounting pressure of the investigation, Clara's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The police's questions grew sharper, their suspicion more pointed. McAllister's methodical approach left no room for evasion, and Clara's responses became increasingly strained. One evening, alone in her room, Clara stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was unrecognizable, haunted, gaunt, and drowning in guilt. She could feel the walls closing in, her secrets threatening to suffocate her. She thought of Edward's lifeless body, the blood pooling beneath him, and the weight of the paperweight in her hand. For a fleeting moment, she had felt free, liberated from his suffocating grip. But now, that freedom came with a price she wasn't sure she could pay. The breakthrough came on July 8, when the detectives obtained a search warrant for Clara's phone and laptop. What they found was the final piece of the puzzle. Edward's obsessive emails to Clara revealed the extent of his manipulation and threats. One email in particular stood out, a message sent just days before his death, where he explicitly warned Clara of the consequences if she defied him. The tone was chilling, almost prophetic. "You know what I'm capable of, Clara. Don't make me show you." But alongside Edward's messages were drafts of unsent emails from Clara, detailing her growing fear and desperation. One draft, written the night of July 3, read, "I can't live like this anymore. I have to end it." For Detective McAllister, the case was becoming clear. Clara was no cold-blooded killer. She was a woman pushed to the brink, trapped in a nightmare orchestrated by Edward Atwood himself. On July 10, with enough evidence to tie Clara to the scene, the police made their move. They arrived at the Atwood estate, their presence sending ripples of panic through the household. Clara didn't resist as they placed her in handcuffs, her face pale but resolute. Daniel watched in stunned silence, his emotions a storm of betrayal and disbelief. As the police escorted Clara out, their eyes met briefly. She wanted to explain, to tell him everything, but the words caught in her throat. In that moment, Clara knew there was no turning back. The truth was out, and the life she had tried so desperately to protect was gone. The courtroom was packed as Clara Atwood took her place at the defense table. The trial, which had captured national attention, was now reaching its final moments. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously, and whispers filled the gallery. To the public, this wasn't just a murder case, it was a saga of power, manipulation, and desperation. But to Clara, it was her life unraveling before an audience. Her defense team painted her as a victim, a woman pushed to the brink by Edward Atwood's relentless manipulation. They revealed his history of coercion, the abusive dynamic he had fostered with Clara, and the evidence of his obsession. Clara's lawyers argued that the events of July 4 were not premeditated but a tragic act of desperation. The prosecution, however, argued otherwise. They pointed to the unsent emails found on Clara's computer, interpreting them as evidence of her intent to confront Edward, and potentially harm him. They framed her actions as those of a woman who had allowed herself to be drawn into a toxic affair and then lashed out when the consequences became too great. The jury deliberated for days. The weight of the evidence, combined with Clara's own tearful testimony, left them divided. Was she a victim, or was she culpable? Was Edward's death an act of self-defense, or had Clara chosen violence to escape her circumstances? On the morning of July 20, the verdict was announced. Clara was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, a lesser charge than murder, acknowledging the mitigating circumstances of Edward's abuse. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some expressing outrage, others sympathy. Clara was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 7. The judge, while condemning her actions, acknowledged the psychological torment she had endured under Edward's control. For Clara, the sentence felt both like a punishment and a reprieve. She had lost everything, her marriage, her freedom, her place in the Atwood family, but she also felt a strange sense of relief. Edward was gone. His shadow no longer loomed over her, and for the first time in years, she could breathe. Daniel Atwood filed for divorce shortly after the trial, his trust in Clara irreparably broken. While the public largely viewed Clara as a victim, Daniel struggled with the reality of her secrets and her affair. Within 2 years, he had remarried, rebuilding his life away from the shadow of the Atwood estate. The Atwood family, once a symbol of affluence and unity, fractured under the weight of Edward's death and the revelations about his character. The estate was eventually sold, its opulent halls emptied of the family that had once called it home. Inside prison, Clara found herself reflecting on the choices that had led her there. She became an advocate for women caught in abusive relationships, sharing her story as a cautionary tale. While she would never fully escape the stigma of Edward's murder, she hoped her experience could help others recognize the signs of manipulation and fight back before it was too late. Even in death, Edward's influence lingered. The secrets he had buried, Catherine Atwood's disappearance, his pattern of predation, slowly came to light as investigative reporters delved into the Atwood family's dark history. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had built his empire not just through business acumen but through ruthless control and exploitation. For the Atwoods, Edward's death marked the end of an era. But for Clara, it marked the beginning of a long journey toward reclaiming her identity. Clara's story is one of love, betrayal, manipulation, and survival. It's a reminder of how power can corrupt and how silence can enable abuse. It asks us to consider, what would you do if you were trapped in a life where every move was controlled? How far would you go to protect yourself, and at what cost? What do you think about Clara's actions? Was she justified in what she did, or could she have found another way out? Do you believe Edward's death was an act of self-defense, or was it premeditated? What would you have done in Clara's position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more cases of complex family dynamics and shocking betrayals, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more gripping tales like this one.